While we're waiting for all attendees to join, now would be a great time to get a bit of feedback to help with today's webinar. Your screen will shortly display the first of two questions. Simply choose your answer, and then we'll go from there. The first question on the poll is coming up now. The next question will be launching now. And once again, we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and answer. As our product catalog and features are ever expanding, I thought we'd take a minute out to see if you're familiar with some of the more recent additions. The EQMS module is integrated with EPC's repository to reuse key quality topics such as documents, processes, regulations, bringing additional value to your current EPC implementation. Interfacing low-code platform is fully independent and licensed module that can be added to your current EPC implementation. Please contact your account manager today if you're not currently leveraging DBP. Okay, so let's begin, shall we? Hello and welcome. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Dan Candido with Interfacing Technologies, and I'll be your moderator. Let me first thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. Before we begin, let's look at a couple things pretty quick. Your questions will help the Q&A later on in the webinar, so look for the questions module to the right of the screen to submit any queries you may have. Immediately following the webinar, you'll receive a survey. Please take a minute out to complete the survey as it helps both of us to present topics you wish to see featured. You can provide a little product feedback, offer any other comments you wish. Just in case you missed something today after the webinar, we will send you a copy of today's slide deck with a link to the webinar and our contact information for you to share with colleagues. Today, we will introduce Interfacing's own Scott Armstrong, who will present a live demonstration of the new features in EPC's Content Mining Parser. And once our live demo is complete, we'll open up the floor to any questions that you may have sent our way. Content Mining Parser's new features and enhancements today will be presented by Scott Armstrong, Managing Partner with Interfacing. Scott is also the product evangelist for Interfacing's flagship Enterprise Process Center suite and an acknowledged subject matter expert in the field of business process management and compliance software. Welcome, Scott. The screen is yours.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the intro. All right, everyone. Thanks for attending today's session. Your attendance is greatly appreciated because it allows us to get feedback in terms of our new releases and as well as helps you leverage the solution. In terms of the polls that were taken, what was quite interesting is that I'm happy to hear that over 80% of you are using the parser already today, meaning there's a small subset of you that haven't yet leveraged the parser within your deployment of the EPC. I could also say that over 80% are using structured documents, whereas about 45% of you are using unstructured documents. So that's a good mix as well. And in terms of the type of content, overwhelmingly, not surprisingly, at 75%, it's really focused on the process portion of the solution. However, I'm happy to say that all the other content, regulatory requirements, glossary terms, KPIs, assets, are all close to 50% as well, meaning it's really being leveraged across all the repository to mass import and update your content. So that's a great. You should be able to now see my screen. And
Absolutely.
Dan, if you could
we can
just
see it.
confirm that, great. So as Dan mentioned, feel free to ask some questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. We do have a bunch of different scenarios to cover today and how the new functionality aligns with supporting those scenarios. So maybe some of the blockers you've hit in the past or documents that weren't able to parse very easily, the new functionality will really speed up that process as well as ensure quality of the content that is imported. So the first actual situation that we're going to be focused on is the support of what we refer to as complex processes. What do I mean by that? Is historically, when you imported, whether it was from Excel or from Word, the system automatically created the process map in a sequential form, meaning task 1 here would be linked to task 2, task 2 to 3, 3 to 4, so on and so forth. Now note, it has nothing to do with the ID, and that's actually something I could remove, nor did it relate to the sequence number. It was really in terms of the order of your content, whether it was in, like I mentioned, a Word doc, it's the order at which we picked up the task information that the process map was developed. But the limitation of that is that then you have a single path. And as we know, within complex processes, the reality is there's decision points with multiple endpoints and multiple different paths. So it's great for parsing and extracting standard operating procedures that you've built in the past, because already that's a huge step. But what about if you wanted to do a process charter that collects very complex maps in an easy format for your end users? So how do you do that? It's as easy as in your current process charters that you've developed in Excel or in Word to add a new column called successor. And successor is what is the task that is after that task. And note, this applies to all flow objects, not only to tasks. So again, it's not dependent on the sequence number. It's really based on picking up the name of those activities and then linking them together. So as you can see, invoice received, the successor is review OCR scan. Now, the next thing I will mention though, since the default logic is that if you put them in order already, and in this case, you see I have, based on the sequence number, you actually don't need to put all of the successors. What I mean by that is really, we only need those that aren't linked in order or are decision points because there's multiple paths coming out of them. So in this case, really, I didn't need to fill those in. I only needed to fill in the 2 decision points in this case for this process, meaning the rest would have already been imported correctly based on the original default rule. So, but what I really want to make sure is that I breach, right, based on gateways, multiple different paths, and then it will continue to follow the default rule. So why I'm mentioning this is that you don't need to define it for every activity. You could just define it on any specific ones. Maybe it could be based on a loopback or on a decision point, and the magic will be taken care of by the system. Now, before we bring this in though, there's one other important thing to mention is that type is also now supported. And why is this important for complex paths? Because note, it will work that you could, right, based on BPMN rules, link a task to multiple different successor tasks, right? That's supported by BPMN and it's allowed within the application. However, as we know, most people will use a gateway, right, a decision point based on when you're breaking paths. So in this case, now we've added type, so you can integrate this into your process charter as well. And now not only import all your content as type task, but really define starts, ends, gateways, intermediate activities. So again, a bit more complex for someone to know this level of detail, right? If you've just surveyed all your end users, you might want to keep it to a minimal or add it afterwards, because the more things they need to understand, the call it harder it will be to import all that content out of their minds very easily. Collect, I should say, rather than import. And the other thing that we've added here, which when I'll run through it, is adding roles is not new, but now we've added the ability to add RASI. So we'll define that to a more micro level. And in this use case too, I've also added some process analytics, meaning now support all the time, durations, delays, high risk path, critical path, all these types of items. So let's go ahead and select this process. And maybe first what I could show you is obviously once you've defined a process charter, right, a form, for those of you who already know this, it's nothing new, but if you haven't been using it, it's not something you need to define every single time. Once you've defined it once, you've built your template, you can reuse it over and over again, and without doing anything more, as you can quickly see, all the data is highlighted and available, meaning I don't need to build a new template from zero. The content would have already been parsed, and I can go ahead and directly from here, export it to the server. I'll take a step back afterwards and retag that just to walk you through it, since there are some new options in there and you're aware of on how to use them. But now when I actually go into the EPC here, yes, all of my activities have been imported with their associated roles and their different task types, as well as what you'll notice here is that this is no longer a single path process. It has multiple decision points and connecting even, as you can see, based on the decision to the same end event, as well as you'll also notice that the purple path is actually the critical path. This is a secondary path. So why is that important? Because critical path we use commonly in terms of for analysis as well as for your end users, right? If you ever want to keep your processes simple, remember you can always filter as a view for your end users only on critical path, meaning if you're mapping all paths and all paths turn into 40 tasks, but you want to keep things simple, you can cut it down that they only view the 10 and then can expose those additional paths as required. Now, the other item you'll notice based on the import is these little calculators, because I've turned on within my map options. I'm a process analyst and we're doing some process improvement. So again, something that you do not want for all your users is the analysis for your end users. It's not of importance unless you want to communicate to them what is the expectation in terms of target average time. That might be of interest. But besides that, this is really used for your analysts to do some process improvement. And what you'll see here is it's brought in the processing time per activity as well. And if I go ahead and run the analysis report on this process, as you can quickly see, it's brought in my total average lead time and meaning the duration of the critical path and all the granular details of every activity that we've brought in and whether or not they're critical or not and the average processing time. So we can very quickly see where the bottlenecks are in the process. So to recap, we'll take a step back here, maybe one more item. Yes, we had in the past always the ability to define the role. The difference is the step further that we've taken, right? If I click on one of these activities, is now I can actually see the level of responsibility that was defined. And in this case, we defined it as responsible. So if I go back to the actual parser, clear all, remove, my template that we pre-processed, how do I go ahead and tag all this information? First thing, this isn't the new option, right? You're choosing the row header or the column header. In this case, this table is a column header, and the meaning this is the attribute and these are the values. But what I do want to mention, we do have a new option called without header, which I'll cover quickly later, that certain tables that you might be processing may not have a dedicated header. So this is actually only content. You don't want to skip one of your rows. And in this case, nothing new here, but why I want to mention it is before you were using tasks because they were all being imported as tasks. Now you got to leverage the flow object because flow object allows you to define the type of flow object. Note, if you don't define the type, by default, it will be task anyways. So the only time you would use task is if you really want to hard code it, a certain item as a task. And in this case, we're going to say it's the flow object sequence number, flow object name. This is that new option of flow object successor. It's right here. And then we have the type. So again, flow object shape type. Role, that's right now we don't go under the process, we go under org because it's a different module. And under role, you'll see all these new options. Now, not only did we add RASCI VS, but also CRUD. So this we're not going to cover today in one of our use cases for the demo, but note those of you that are importing metadata can use CRUD for create, read, update, delete based on your actual entities and attributes. So in this case, you see we can define it as responsible or accountable, and I'll skip modified time, bring in process flow object, actual processing time, and then path. Now note, what's important to mention here is that there's certain formats that are required for default values like processing time or path. So please refer to the help files in terms of the format at which you must capture those values as well as the content. So as an example here for critical, it's the word critical in all caps or high risk. So note, it's all available online within the help files, and then simply parse that content, as you can see, and then export it to the server, which we've already done. But note, you'll see here, again, the preview, as well as the associations amongst those activities and their relationships. Quite straightforward. But for those of you using the tool, obviously this brings a lot of value for being able to not only build based on discovery work with process charters, but also to export your content into Excel as an example. Then you can have it filled in again with all the, let's say, processing times and the different paths, and then re-import it back into the solution. And that's actually one of the changes for you to know. It's not a new option. We always had this in the past, but within the new version is create and reuse the default setting versus create new object used to be the default. Why? Because people weren't changing the option and then they were duplicating a lot of their data, but really they wanted to just update the current content within the environment. Again, I'll export it just to show you, but there's nothing new here. We already did this. So I just decided to, just for sake, the purpose to demonstrate, because I selected update, you see it's re-updated the same content that we already had on the server. So next use case that we're going to get into relates to objects other than EPC, objects other than process that now you have the ability to define relationships. So I'll go ahead and select a different file. In this case, we're going to use a regulation as an example instead of a process for those of you that are using the system to manage content outside of processes like your regulations. And again, once you've defined it, you don't need to redefine it every single time. In this case, it was already done, right? Meaning these templates, and note there are multiple pages. People have asked that in the past that you can navigate through. And these are reusable across users. So that's the other question that's come up in the past, meaning they're shared. If you have a team that is building content, those templates will be reusable across the team. So I don't actually have to go through every single tag again because none of these tags are new, just to save a bit of time within the demo. But what I will show you is that what is new about this functionality is historically, you were only able to do relationships to process, whereas now relationships work across all objects. And the rule for relationships is the furthest left object is the root. So in this case, rule is the root object. So everything to the right, pretty much standard, Excel-based rules that everyone uses, is that if I had a rule here, then if there's risks or controls, those are all related to this rule. So that's how the system reacts. But it's not specific to rules, it's all objects. So any table, it will automatically make that relationship. So again, rule name, description, category, country. In this case, example, that the role was accountable, that was attached, versus responsible, which is what we used earlier. Then here, it's actually process sequence, process. So not only can you link it to documents or controls, but you could also link it to objects that aren't direct relationships, meaning normally you link the rule to the process. Well, this can be done in inverse, meaning even if the tool doesn't allow you to do it in the UI, via the parser, you can make those relationships as long as, of course, it's supported in the backend. So you are able to link rules to processes as well as to documents, controls, and in this case, associating it to additional rules as well. Now note, same as in the past, the call it core rule of the application is you can actually link to multiple objects within a single cell by adding line breaks. So this rule is linked to two other rules within this specific cell. Again, you have all the preview here, different processes that are going to be imported, all the different objects and their relationships. Again, can import this directly. Note that, as you can see, it's not only limited to rule to rule, but rule to role, rule to doc, so on and so forth, as well as the root of others, control to rule in this case. So what I'll do is I'll jump back over to the process portion. What you'll see is it brought in those additional processes that we just created because they didn't exist. Note that if they already existed in the system, they would have made the relationship directly to your incident management process. But in this case, it didn't exist, so it created a new process. And if I go ahead and click on incident management, you'll quickly see that it's linked to 3 rules now automatically. So these are the regulations that govern the incident management process. What you'll notice here too, that rule, once I've clicked on it, is actually also linked to the role, which is accountable, as well as to other rules and documents. Let's go ahead and pull up the full list that we've imported through this Excel. And very quickly, you'll see all those rules with all their relationships, the roles, the docs, descriptions, so on and so forth. And here's that example that we looked at earlier that was actually linked to 2 separate rules. As you can see, since there was a line break in the cell, it's made those relationships. The other item too, as I mentioned, there were controls in there as well. So all that content was imported into the other module, or again, it's not limited to process. Of course, if it already existed, it would have binded it based on name or ID. And here again, you see the control with the different regulations, as well as the role that was imported, ESA regulatory manager, and all the relationships of that role now that he's accountable for all these rules. So we're not going to go through many different scenarios, but note this example that I've demoed to you today on rule applies to every object within the system, meaning it supports relationships across all objects, provided that they're supported within the application, of course. So let's jump to our next use case, which is looking at unstructured rules, because we've added a lot of functionality to support unstructured documents. Note that this, again, is not limited to rules. It's just I'm using rules as a use case, whereas in the past, I gave you different examples with work instructions or SOPs that you have internally. So in this case, let's select ISO 27000. This is a completely unstructured document. This is actually the requirement. We haven't changed it in any form. This is as is, meaning, you can get access to this information in a PDF. We've simply opened that PDF, and now we'll parse it and bring it into the system. That way, when there's a new version of a requirement that comes out, you can update all your current requirements by parsing and extracting all the new and updated regulations and compare to see what changed, and then of course analyze the downstream impacts. None of that is new, right? But that's for those of you that haven't today leveraged the regulatory rules module. Now within here, this case, again, I could, go ahead and select a pre-built template. And just to show you, it will all be pre-processed because this content was already created with certain rules without doing anything. You see it's parsed the entire document with the descriptions, the rule names, the folders, and built all my hierarchies as well as all my control folders. But again, let's not import this one directly. Let's actually start from zero so that I can show you some of the different features that have been added. Now, the first item, as we scroll through the document, is there's certain content you may not want. So we've added a function that will actually allow you to remove parsed content before actually importing it into the system. But let's start from zero and just show you how to do the end-to-end process for those of you that haven't been utilizing the system for unstructured document content. So the first thing what I'll do here is, in this case, we're going to tag it as a rule folder, meaning I want to group these rules based on context of the organization, which is pretty standard for any of you that know ISO. It's really across most of the requirements. And then this one we'll say is the actual rule. So I'll tag it as the rule name. I can also see that there's multiple different levels of granularity, whereas here I have, you see a 6.1.2. So same thing in this use case. I want that also to be a rule, meaning I don't want that content to be brought in as a single rule, which it would have been. I want to break it down further to more granular requirement management, because often companies are managing these as just call it a whole section. But the limitation of that is that the reality is you may need separate controls or separate processes or docs to support the more granular content within the regulatory requirements. So I can go ahead and with that parse, show you. And now it's already tagged all the rules and the folders, but it has not tagged all the descriptions. So in this case, let's go ahead and highlight a big piece. And I'm going to show you an example that's actually not going to parse everything on purpose to show you one of our other features we've added. Where here now, if I do rule description and then parse it, you see it's automatically applied to the entire document, but there is certain content that was excluded. You see like here, notes. Now again, that's the value of the parsing of the content manually, is it will pick up all the formatting. like bullet points, whether these were you see letters or numbers. I could have not imported the numbers as the same type of content. I may have said the numbers, meaning the bullets below, were actually controls that were linked to that rule. So when you get into more granular types of docs, depending on the document, manual tagging is very useful. But when you're not, one of the new features we've added is what's called auto tag. What auto tag does, it will actually uh, automatically find all the text between any of your objects and tag it the description automatically. So it doesn't matter the format that it's in. It doesn't care. It's going to say from task 1 to task 2 or from rule 1 to rule 2. I want everything else to be put into the rich text. So it's just a way to save a lot of time in terms of your tagging efforts. But of course, you could have just simply, in this case, tag this again as rule description and then reparsed. And that also would have satisfactorily, you see, tagged all the notes, added them because I don't want to drop them. But the value is you may want to drop them sometimes. So pros and cons, right? Speed versus granular parsing where you want to tag things, different types of attributes and objects. So now we can see very quickly that it's brought in our entire rule folder set and rules. But in ISO 27K, there's, for those of you know, right, there's Annex A, and Annex A are actually controls. So the system actually stopped the parsing automatically because it knew it was a new section in the document. But I do want to mention that the system now supports, if you flag this as a new object set, it will automatically create a new, call it core object. What do I mean by that? When I say core, I mean really the root, because I don't want all of these controls linked to the rules above. They're really independent. That's the whole concept of like being able to tag different sections of the doc, different content, but then still support different types of relationships. So in this case, we're going to actually flag this as our rules set name, meaning you see it's a new root object. It's a new the set. And then within here, this is a more complex table. So this is a reason why I want to talk to you about this, because functionality has been added to support non-standard type tables, right? Earlier using Excel, those were very clean tables. These ones, on the other hand, are not. Meaning one, you can see that the first column, the first row doesn't have the same number of columns as the second. Additionally, we can see that there's random breaks within the document, within the table. So we don't want to treat this as a separate table than this one. And in different docs, you may have a use case where there is zero header. Like in this case, there is a header, but it's different than the actual table number of columns. And in this case, you see there is no header. So this would be a good example where you may want to use the without header option. It allows you to directly tag the information, meaning before normally, and I'll show you, specify the header, right, in the past. Now you can actually tag the values directly, and it'll work like it did before with your header. Meaning why, again, just to explain, is you don't want to lose one row of content when there is no header. But in this case, we're going to do even something more complex that is supported than that, just removing the header. We don't want this to come in all the content. First of all, we don't want this word control to come in because it's a repetitive control that it doesn't add value. Additionally, is we want to group our folders, meaning based on the types of controls. So in this case here, I'm going to actually tag directly instead of using the table. So in the past, we used table tagging, which is this one, right? where you're tagging the entire table. Now we support more complex rules inside of tables because it knows the cells with standard parsing. So if I go ahead and tag this as the rule folder name, rule folder name, because we're grouping these. Oh, excuse me, even worse, I'm in control. So control folder name, and then under control folder, we want to tag the actual controls, and first the control ID in this case, the control name, and then this section is the actual control description, meaning we want to dump this word control. And now when I go ahead and parse, what you'll see is it's more intelligent, meaning instead of treating the entire cell like we did within Excel, it's not tagging certain words that weren't, as well as it's applied now across all the different tables, even though they're in different types of formats. So it's added more intelligence to this actual algorithm. And then from there, we can go ahead, and one thing I'll add here is we're going to teach the model. It's one thing, and I'll explain how that works based on all the content we've just tagged, and go ahead and export this to the repository directly. But note, you don't really need to export it to the repository, right? You could always preview all the content right here. You see we already have control folders, the rule folders, so on and so forth, that we will see in this tool. And the one item I did forget to mention that you may not want, like in an ISO requirement, normally you don't want to import the first 3 sections. You want to start at section 4, and I forgot to mention that. At the beginning here, let's go to section and just actually remove that content, highlight it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's that feature I mentioned earlier where you can just go ahead and highlight it and remove it out of the content. So you see now we're actually only going to be importing the requirements, but I had already exported it to the server, so we would have brought them in anyways. Let's go ahead and go to the rules. And now you see, here's all those, the rule folder, context of the organization with, if I go to the context of the organization, you can quickly see all the content, as well as the same thing goes for the controls, information security reference controls, and the organization controls, people controls, physical controls, so on and so forth, with all of their details. Note, for those of you who aren't aware, right, you can always view this content here, but a nice fast way is to use the expand function. This works for all modules. And as you scroll, it'll continue to load all the content. Very easy way to read when you have big lists of information. And of course, and you also want to see all of its relationships as well, not only the content directly, like in this case, associated risks. So let's go back here to our actual document. And earlier we clicked the teach model. So what did that do? What it's actually doing is, if you remember from past versions, we have within the settings, the ability to add your own content that will be auto tagged within your future docs. What I mean by that is under auto tag settings, you have this template, first of all, that you can download if you're unaware, but let's go ahead and download one that the actual content that we've now trained. And you can quickly see here, all those rules and rule folders are now added into our reusable repository of information. What do I mean by that? Is that in the current previous versions, you would import this information, right? You might have had export all your assets from an application in-house, or even from EPC. So that way when you're actually parsing the content, anywhere in the text, it finds that asset name, it can tag it the asset or the role or the term or whatever. But the value here is that what if you don't have a whole repository full of information? As you build out your content through the import function, what you can do is keep teaching it, and it'll get smarter over time to pre-recognize this content within your future docs. So if I clear all and go down, let's say, to that section again, to here, and then hit auto tag regulations, you see it's automatically tagged the rules and the rule folders based on that we've already processed this type of information. So as you can imagine, when there's a new version of this requirement in the future, it could automatically tag all that content because you've already pre-processed it. And then we could have gone and did the auto tag of description again. And as you can see, within one click, automatically it actually updates all the procedures, the descriptions of those objects, because using rule description, rule name, so on and so forth. Again, very quick way to build out that content. So now we've touched on the auto tag, the left, ignore left margin. By default, this one is on, but note what it is depending on your file, you may or may not want to analyze the indentations. So as an example, in this one, I have it on because you see, based on the area of the doc, there's all sorts of different formats they use. For some reason, they have different indentations in different areas of the doc. So I didn't want to take that into consideration. But certain other files that you're processing, indentation has different rules. So to get higher quality results, you may want to take that into consideration. So it's easy as clicking it on and off to see how it impacts the results. But usually keeping it off, I feel, is the higher quality. It's more when you have very complex documents, each with very minor different indentation levels. We're not going to go through custom rules because that's not new in this new version, but remember, those are all available within the rule builder. And then the next item we're actually going to get into is related to processing KPIs. So for those of you that are using the system for importing metrics, right? Could be monthly, quarterly, weekly. It's a very easy way to run a report on an external system and then bring in all that metadata into the application. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and select now another file. I have some here. Note, we can share you some of these templates if you want to use them as is. We'll upload them into the help files, so you will have them available if you want to reuse the same format. But note, there's no dependency on these formats. These were just samples that I created. So the first one I'm going to do is single KPI versus importing many metrics across different KPIs all at once. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I want to show you also the ability to define the thresholds as well using the parser, since that's also new. So again, I already have a template. I'm not going to restart from zero again for sake of time. It's nothing new there, right? I've tagged that the KPI name, KPI ID. And the difference is what is new is range type, threshold, 1, 2, 3. So what I'll do here, just to re-show you, range type is under performance, KPI. And here now you have range type as an option. Range type, to explain what does that mean in performance. I don't have a KPI yet, so let's import it and then to show you, and it'll actually do it automatically. So range type, as you can see, is red, yellow, green, meaning it's a simple distribution with 2 levels from red to yellow and then from yellow to green, right? We also support green, yellow, red, or red, yellow, green, yellow, red, depending on the different types of thresholds. And we'll show you that within the product. But the second item, because this is 3 levels, you need 2 ranges. So it's yellow threshold, in this case, performance, KPI, range 1, and then the second one, range 2. It's as easy as that, not very complicated. As you can see, there's up to 4 ranges because it depends on the type of range type. In this case, we only need 2. And then automatically at the same time, because I want to skip a step, I also not only create the KPI with its thresholds, but I also want to bring in a lot of values based on the measure, the date, and the comment. So in this case, go ahead and export, right? These options are again, performance, KPI, measure value, measure date, measure comment. Quite straightforward. Now let's go ahead and to the performance module. Now note, this may have already existed in your survey. You didn't have to create something new. I'm just showing you how you can create a new, but it's not a limitation. You can use the create and update. So what you'll quickly see here is not only did it create the KPI, but it also created the thresholds, red, right, yellow, green, based on 10 and 30, which was the 2 different ranges we set, as well as brought in all the history related to this metric, its dates, its comments, so on and so forth. And just to show you what I meant by what are those different range types, for those that aren't familiar, you see we use the red, yellow, green, but there's different types within the app supported within the tool. Now, the next use case would be, the reality is I may want to import mass data. I don't want to do one KPI at a time, right? That's quite inefficient. So in this case, I could run a report against many KPIs, let's say against SAP, extracting all sorts of summary data, but I want to visualize it within the tool, but also link it to my different processes, or it could have been coming out of my incident management tool or my customer contact center tool to find inefficiencies within our processes, as well as report to people how they're performing. So in this case, I'm going to use the multi KPI. It's just another Excel spreadsheet. And to save time for demo, you see I've pre-tagged it, but it's just an Excel spreadsheet table, as you can see. And in this case, KPI name, KPI unique identifier, measure value, measure date, comment. And again, it's pre-built that content on the side. So remember, right, I could always have tagged this manually. There's no magic. I mean, there's nothing I did special, but just to show you why, again, column header, tag, column header type, KPI, name, KPI, ID, KPI, value. Now you know why I skipped some of them. Measure date and measure comment, and then go ahead and parse. So again, very straightforward. Then I'm exporting it, done. And refresh the screen, as what you'll very quickly see that in this case, first of all, it updated our current KPI that we just imported, because I did use the option of the create and reuse. And as you can see, the KPI number of invoice issued, API 1, was the one we had created originally, as well as it also has another KPI in here, number of invoices paid, KPI AP2. So why did I do this as a use case? Just to show you that it supports updating current as well as automatically creating new, and you can do many all at once within a single file, meaning if it doesn't exist already on the server, it will create a new one for you. And it brought in all the values, and it brought in all the values. But you see for the second one, I hadn't defined a threshold for it yet, whereas this one we did. So that's the next use case. And the final use case for today, for sake of time, is related to leveraging the parser for translations, so for mass translations. It's another great utility for the tool because, yes, as everyone knows, and if you don't, you should, that we do have an auto translation feature that is really nice, and we have improved it within the upcoming release. But in terms of applying to more objects, all the flow objects at once, it's a really nice, right, function that allows you to automatically make recommendations based on the content. See, so it will maintain your rich text formatting and suggest the translations directly within the tool. It's not that there's any limitation of this feature. It is a great feature, but what if you want to you built out 1,000 processes and procedures, or you processed all your old content and you want to update it, all the translations at once. You don't want to click one by one, right? It takes a bit of time to do that. Another use case is often companies are using external translators. So what they do is they map all their content and build all the content. They generate a book, send it to their external translators, and then bring all that content back in. Again, a great time saving. So that's the use case I'll give you here. I've created a book. We can share this book with you. It's simply, in this case, the process name, ID, and the rich text, then the activity name, ID, type, and procedure. Now note, it is very important that you use a book that contains the ID. And for activity, it's also good to have type. But note that, why am I saying that? ID is a must, because no longer can we match up based on name, because the name has been translated. So the name is, right, in language A versus B is different. So it won't find the original. So instead it'll just create a new object in the other language. ID is the only thing that we can guarantee will be the same after translation. So let's go ahead and run this book. Nothing new here. You've all seen this before. Now this book, it's just a Word doc that's going to be generated. And let me go to my downloads. So it's opened here on my other screen. What you can see here, nothing fancy, just the exact template I just showed you. It includes the screenshots, it includes links to external sources. All that is maintained within the parser. That's one of the powers of the system, is that it does support all your rich text formatting. So you can leverage it for these purposes and all the activities within this process. Note, I could very quickly even use the auto translate function in Word to mass translate the entire document all at once. And you'll see now I've applied it into French, this entire file. Save that. And now go ahead and go to my parser. Now that the file exists in a new language, go to Knowledge processes. And in this case, again, I've pre-built a template. We're not going to retag it again because we're running out of time. And what you'll see here is the entire template was tagged. Again, nothing new in terms of functionality that was added on this, but it's important to note that this is a great use case for using the tool. So I know that a lot of customers weren't aware that you could leverage the parser for this. It's brought in all that French processes and activities, as well as their translated descriptions, rich text, so on and so forth. which I can then directly export to the server. Now, note one thing that's very important when exporting, when using it for translation purposes, the parser, is to translate to the correct language, obviously. So you don't want to override your current content because it will, right? If we matched it up. So you can directly from these settings export to a different language without switching your language within the EPC. Oops, I didn't have to refresh the entire page since I'm in English right now. What you'll notice is I didn't obviously override the English. That's the first thing to mention. And then two is if I go into the French, you'll see here all that content full screen was actually brought into the French language dynamically, as well as it maintained my rich text formatting and my links to external sources, my screenshots. So very, very user-friendly. And the same thing if I actually go ahead and switch into French, my content. And now navigate to this process. Now I can't look for process invoice because we're in the French content. So in this case, we'll look for the new name that was translated. Facture. And we can see traité de facture, facture approuvée. And here's again that entire process with all of the activities, with all of the translations applied, including all the rich text. So that's the last use case we're going to cover for today. Just to summarize what we looked at, not only a lot of the new features that have been added, but also we looked at complex processes, process analytics, KPI metrics, unstructured document processing, object relationships beyond process for all other objects, and the ability to mass update translations, as well as mass update KPI metrics. And just the last item to mention, which I forgot to cover, is this new option, which is called association models. And just to explain, now note this is explained again within the help files, but what it actually does is default is it'll treat one root object versus table model will actually treat your tables independently. So it's sort of what I was explaining earlier. Now it's best you probably take a look at the help files, but you may want table one related to table two, like in this case where process and tasks are related. So imagine the table one was process and table two, like an example we did earlier, was rules. So this would be a rule folder. Default, and we're planning to rename this, default will actually link all these rules to this process because the second table relates to the first one. Table model, this one actually treats them differently, meaning there's no relationship amongst all my tables. I may have one table that has controls, one table that has rules, one table that has roles, but I don't want them associated. Best example I could give you for the default is imagine you're processing an SOP where you had content first that was all related to the process, and then you had a list of all the roles. But you want all those roles and regulations linked to the process directly. They're all related to one source. So that's the best I can explain it very simply in the time we have. But note, there is information on it, and we can definitely help you with designing templates that meet your needs, as well as helping you parse any specific docs that you may be having trouble with. All right, Dan, are there any questions?
I actually have one very quick question that we see here. Can you parse inside tables, even in Word documents?
Yes, so it's a great question. Actually, this is a Word document that we just showed you, right? This was the translated Word file. This is a Word file. And in here, these are Word tables that I generated out of EPC in using the template. And as you can see, there's two separate tables. And then all I did was I used the auto translate function. So we brought in the French version, but these are tables inside of Word. And when you're using the Word or Excel, it doesn't matter. You have the same options. Column header versus row header. So let's say I were to actually clear all these. In this case, it's obviously a column header, right? But let's pretend this one is also column header, but it could have been a row header, meaning these are the values, and this is the attribute. So no limitation in terms of inside Word versus inside Excel, both supported and have all the same features.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Scott. I think that is it for the questions. I see that we are running a little short on time, so I think we'll end it here. And I'll switch over to my screen. And then if you can just let me know, Scott, you can see my screen.
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you. Once again, thank you, Scott Armstrong, for his excellent demonstration of our content mining parser's new features. I'd like to add that Interfacing offers a digital twin software solution that documents, analyzes, improves, digitizes, and monitors your business processes. More information can be found at interfacing.com or send us an email at sales@interfacing.com to inquire. If you love EPC as much as I do, you will download your own personal, fully functional, free trial of EPC today. Request a live demonstration of our other products at interfacing.com, book a demo. Additionally, please join the Interfacing community where you can complete a free BPMN 2.0 certification and EPC modeler training program, as well as participate in our discussion forums and go through the common FAQs. So to close out, thank you for attending. And soon after this webinar, you'll receive a brief survey with an email where you can download and share today's presentation. You'll also have our contact information, so I urge you to reach out if you have any questions regarding your process-based initiatives. With that, I'd like to thank you and wish you all a very good morning, a good day, or a good evening. Take care and talk to you soon.